So, dear and respected friend, thank you so much for your kind participation. And we are going to start today's session with an invocation of a song. So let me just share the screen. Thank you, dear and respected friend. Thank you so much for your kind attention. I, Randhir Kumar Gautam, on behalf of Swadhyay Sahchak, Circle of Co-Learning and Mutual Studies, welcome you to attend today's international webinar on the very topic, mapping the transition from being to becoming, normalization versus internalization of operations. It is a movement of extreme pleasure to welcome the guests who are virtually present here to attend this international webinar. First of all, I welcome Ain-Ul Khair from Central European University, Vienna. I welcome Professor Anant Giri from Madras Development Institute, Professor Gyan Gului from Vienna, a great scholar and a great seeker, and all the respected participants, viewers, both on Zoom platform, YouTube platform, and Facebook platform. Let me give a first brief introduction of our Swadhyay Sahchak Circle of Co-Learning and Mutual Studies. It is an initiative of studying and learning together self, culture, societies, and the world. Friends associated with this are eager to walk and mediate with new horizons of thinking and new movements of social and cultural change at work in our contemporary world. We study seekers such as great philosopher Sri Aurobindo, Mahatma Gandhi, Chittaranjan Das, a creative thinker from Odisha, and many others from around the world. We also present our own writings and reflect upon our creativity together. We invite seekers from different fields of life to share with us their experience, lives, vision, sadhana, and a struggle for creating a world of beauty, dignity, and dialogue. We organize talk almost every Sunday in a month, and sometimes Wednesday also. We have collaboration with different institutions in India and abroad, and we are looking for our co-nurturers. Let me also give a brief introduction to speaker of today's session, Ain-Ul Khair. She is currently pursuing her PhD from International Relation at the Doctoral School of Political Science, Public Policy and International Relations from Central European University, Austria. She did her graduation as well as one master from Jamia Millia Islamia, and she has also done her second master in gender studies in CUE, Hungary, and she will be teaching refugee students in collaboration with Open Society University Network in East Africa, and she is a research fellow at Dera Vaskara Foundation in association with ACED Global Solution, United Kingdom. So, may I invite a respected speaker, Ain-Ul Khair, to present her presentation, which is entitled Mapping the Transition from Being to Becoming, Normalization versus Internalization of Oppression. So over to you.
So good afternoon to some of you who are joining us from Europe, and good evening to everyone else who has been kind enough to be present here today. I'll be talking about this paper that I'm currently in the process of writing. In collaboration with Dara Baskara Foundation, where I'm currently a research fellow. So the paper mapping the transition from being to becoming, normalization versus internalization of oppression, has derived its inspiration from the works of Dr. Rachel Baskara, Dr. Rachel Baskara, who has done a lot of work on oppression. So in the paper, I revisit the existing literature on oppression in general and probe the internalization of oppression in detail. Though based on the exploration of the existing literature, the internalization of oppression is often used synonymously and interchangeably with normalization of oppression. This interchangeable usage needs further probing. One can maintain that often while investigating and discussing literature on oppression, normalization of it is conveniently ignored and therefore remains still understudied and unexplored. Consequently, it is reasonable to say that there is much dearth within the existing literature on the normalization of oppression, which can help us further distinguish it from the internalization of oppression and therefore requires further exploration. In this paper, I introduced the normalization of oppression as a distinctive concept from the internalization of oppression. While internalization can be argued to be a self sabotage, a result of decades of attempts at normalization of oppression, normalization of oppression can be seen as an attempt in the process to institute the internalization of oppression. I argue that normalization of oppression is a process of which internalization can be seen, therefore, as a distinctive feature. Normalization of oppression, therefore, can be said that is a means and a process, and internalization of oppression is an end and a successful culmination of oppressive methods at the subjugation of certain groups of people. The research questions that find themselves at the core of this paper are: is normalization of oppression the same as the internalization of oppression? And does normalization of oppression lead to internalization of oppression? I reintroduce oppression as a concept where I cite authors such as Anne Kurd, Iris Marion Young, and Rachel Baskara, while Kurd identifies oppression as the harm and as the coercion condition. Young identifies oppression as a structural phenomena that immobilizes or diminishes a group. Young highlights the importance of social groups and social group identity to analyze oppression. Young insists on the heterogeneity of every socially identified group, asserting that the cause of oppression are embedded in unquestioned norms, habits, and symbols, in the assumption underlying institutional rules and the collective consequences of following those rules. She identifies five phases of oppression, which are exploitation, marginalization, powerlessness, cultural imperialism, and violence. Baskara identifies the lacuna in the literature of oppression as a concept and attempts to address it exactly. Subverting the conventional understanding of oppression with its transactionary analysis, Baskara identifies oppression as a tool for the advancement of substantive equality. Challenging Young's argument of there not being any essence to the concept of oppression, Baskara argues for the intellectual and conceptual clarification of concepts such as oppression to offer conceptual backing to contemporary emancipatory movements. To understand oppression in much more depth and detail, it becomes rather imperative for our understanding and for the purpose of this paper to analyze and comb through the concept of internalization of oppression. While Fur identifies internalized oppression as both a state and a process, Barbara Love takes it further and argues that internalized oppression is a process and action. Hardeman and Jackson understand internalized oppression as an accepted reality by the oppressed, while E.J.R. David asserts that internalized oppression can be arguably be regarded as the most insidious consequence of oppression. Pike calls internalized oppression as a hidden injury of oppression that is often ignored or minimized. Centered around the conception of internalized oppression, one can make two observations. First, the most important characteristic of internalized oppression, which also serves its definition, is its invisibilized makeup. Second, the internalized oppression undermines the agency of the oppressed. Interestingly, Bhaskara in her work tackles the complicacy of internalization of oppression, viewing that people must internalize social hierarchies in order to function in society, in order to function well. If one is born into an oppressive society, then one is compelled to internalize oppressive norms and social practices. Once internalization is successful, it becomes harder to see the injustice in the hierarchy because it becomes ingrained in one's psyche as just how things are. From this, one can already begin to see internalization as an end to a process, which I assert is the process of normalization of oppression. Nabina Levau adds a vital contribution to the literature on the internalization of oppression by bringing in the aspect of agency. She argues that internalized oppression can cause a person to conceive of herself as a deviant agent as well as a reduced one. This self conception creates challenges that are not only captured by merely analyzing a reduced sense of agency. Hilde Nelson talks about the infiltrated consciousness, which leads to the losing of self respect, that based on Rawls' argument of self respect is a primary good, with whose absence, therefore, is even more significant a harm than a deprivation of identity, constitutional role, or relationship. I have also in the paper used a post-colonial and decolonial analysis of internalization of oppression, such as Fanon's work on inverted gaze or EJR Davidson's analysis of internalization of oppression from post-colonial sense. So therefore, on this one can make this observation that internalization of oppression undermines the agency of the oppressed and perhaps also aids the erasure of their identity. Through the substantiated claims of various authors on oppression and internalized oppression, one can therefore claim that the internalization of oppression corrupts the physical, economic, psychological, and political agency of the oppressed, and thereby reduces them to an alienated tools of the oppressors in maintaining the oppressive structures. The analysis of internalization of oppression introduces us to the term normalization of oppression, with which it is often used interchangeably and synonymously. However, in literature, the concept of normalization of oppression could be queered in the sense it is reclaimed by the marginalized and oppressed and is used as a tool against oppression. Using Foucault's analysis of normalization, Cressida Hayes claims that because normalization is outside the dominant frame of reference from understanding for dominant frame of reference for understanding political power, its actions are usually understood as helping individuals realize the capacities of their natural bodies. For this reason, its methods and agents are able to achieve greater access and control that more obviously than more obviously for sovereign forms. To set the premise of the analysis of oppression, we have to view and define normalization of oppression as a form of unwilling and unsolicited transaction between the oppressor and the oppressed. While it is indeed the enforcement of oppressive structures to invisibilize oppression, it is also subverted by the by the oppressed as a coping mechanism. While its attempts at encroaching into the everyday life of the oppressed groups to render itself invisible in order to set the process of internalization of oppression in motion, it also is critically crucial to recognize that the normalization of oppression, when looked at from the lens of the oppressed, becomes a means to survive oppression, not necessarily to adapt to it, but to regain a sense of normalcy in their everyday life. To accentuate the distinctiveness of normalization of oppression and how it can become a sort of coping mechanism, it is imperative to revisit the concept of everyday life, invisibilization, and the ordinariness of it, social groups, and the collective consciousness. I introduce the concept of everyday life because it is in the everyday life of the oppressed that internalization and as well as the normalization of oppression are simultaneously shaping the behavior of the groups of people subjected to it. When probed in the everyday life, one is forced to ask how can oppression become ordinary and the everyday lived reality of the oppressed. When does oppression become the norm? How can one indeed escape it? the inevitability of internalizing oppression becomes the means for survival, then how can one really differentiate between the internalization of oppression and normalization of oppression? When normalization of oppression seeps into the ordinary of everyday life, it has the tendency of being adopted by the oppressed and internalize it in order to survive. However, during the normalization process, the oppressor still retains the agency to decide if they have the means to subvert it, or if they do not have the means to subvert this normalization and therefore succumb to it. Hence, hence we must highlight the importance of social group as well as the attached collective consciousness to exercise agency to resist oppression. When oppressive forces are in action, the target is a social group belonging to a certain identity. The particular social group at the receiving end of this oppression becomes aware of the assault, thus possessing consciousness and awareness of the self. Evidently, the self awareness may not happen instantly, but the violent manifestations of oppression also warrant a collective resistance from the oppressed. This is where collective consciousness flips the encroachment of the oppressed groups space through the normalization of oppression on its head by adapting to it first, to not only survive through it but also to resist the internalization of oppression. This becomes an active form of passively rejecting the enforcement of normalization of new habitus that is built on an oppressive structure. Extrajudicial killings by the state in a militarily occupied territory can be looked at as an example to better understand the subversion of normalization of oppression. Adapting to the fact that extrajudicial killings has become a norm does not tacitly mean accepting it as a norm. The adaptation only becomes a means to an end, a form of coping mechanism defending against self-sabotage. It is crucial to highlight the importance and the urgency of revisiting and reanalyzing the concept of normalization of oppression to be able to do justice to how it is perceived and experienced by people on the ground who juggernaut through the oppressive tactics of the oppressors. It also opens the scope for further investigation of the normalization of oppression from the point of epistemic and ontological privilege, uh, which is currently beyond the scope of this paper. So the rather linear approach to the concept, often at the risk of being ignored in various philosophical and political traditions, needs to be challenged. At the same time as this paper has attempted to do so, it is critically important that such concepts are analyzed from a bottom-up approach, encouraging standpoint epistemology using the lens of the oppressed in order to make significant changes to how such concepts are floated around in intellectual circles without being able to instigate any possible change on the ground level. While calling for any real world change would still be a would still be arguably ambitious, even an exaggeration. However, a bottom up approach from the lens of those who have lived such experiences in moral and analytic philosophy, as well as across other disciplines, must be made obligatory. Otherwise, such intellectual free floating becomes redundant. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. So, may I invite Dr. Ananta Giri to respond or ask some of the questions.
Thank you so much, Ain. Shukriya. So, this is a very deep journey where certain aspect of thinking and the challenges of life, they are woven together. For example, this distinction between internalization and normalization might seem, since you are referring to Binadas and reference to Wittgenstein, and might seem for some people as hair splitting, but it is not really. And therefore, this distinction in understanding, conceptualizing, internalization, normalization, and the challenges of life, as well as overcoming the challenges of life. Overcoming normalization, which really hides pathology, is very important. So therefore, this distinction is very helpful, internalization and normalization. And what you are pointing to, that because it seems normal, therefore it is not internal. And this also holds in other fields of oppression. For example, look at caste oppression. Now there is a everyday sense of normalization, so-called quote-unquote normalization, but that normalization really hides both structural and self-pathology, and people do not internalize it. Therefore, this whole logic of, as R.S. Khair many years ago, almost 40 years ago, wrote a book called The Untouchable, the Untouchable unto himself. He says that though we take it for granted that the caste system is internalized by people, especially at the bottom, in reality it is not. The untouchable unto himself. So similarly, the whole logic of oppression is such that to lead a life, we seem to have a sense of normality, quote unquote, but it is not internalized. And internalization, when it means really agreeing to the canons of the masters or canons of state, and that is not really complete. So therefore, this is a very important work. And what is important always to problematize the whole process of normalization and what it really hides. In a related sense, Jürgen Habermas talks about a process of thinking, a process of argumentation, which we can also relate to a process of awakening, where he says, where the familiar institutions of society turn out to be islands of problematic justice. So therefore, what the process of normalization hides is really our everyday life, the institutions, and the routines. They are really islands of problematic justice. But in a way, they are not really islands of problematic justice. They are continents of problematic justice. Because when we talk about the island, then the island may be, oh, this is happening only in my island, say, so in Ireland or in Costa Rica, but not everywhere. But the kind of normalization that Ain is pointing to, it is really pointing to the continent of problematic justice, the very structures themselves. For example, the kind of normalization of destruction of life, destruction of dignity that we are seeing, say, in places or in Kashmir, in Palestine, and in many places. And they really related to now a continent, the whole humanity, that how we are today entangled. So some of these thoughts come to my mind as I read Ain's paper and listened to her.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ananta, for your kind words. That was really helpful also, because it also, and for the reference, thank you for the references too. I'll look at them, because this also provides, gives you gives us the the new avenues on how to make this, how to make our work more profound and more relatable in that sense. So thank you for your feedback and for the references too. Thank you so much.
Yes. So, any other friend who would like to hear his thought? Maybe Professor Gyan Guli.
Thank you very much. I'm audible.
Yes,
because
yes, you are audible.
thank you very much. Well, it was really very interesting. As such, of course, as regards the contents, and also because for me, I dealt in the past with some points, for instance, of Paulo Freire about the problem of internalization of the oppression that is in the psychological way. And so I found analogies, likenesses, connection also, as at least as regards my suggestions. Now, well, I think there are very many points which I would like to develop, to mention at least. Of course, the time is not so much, but I will try to synthesize what I have taken as notice. For instance, one of the strategies, for instance, of every process, it comes back very many times, independently of the countries, of the historical moments in which we are, in which we are dealing with. But one of the points which a strategy for instance, of oppression has is to convince the oppressed that they are not people, that it is not possible, so to speak, to transcend oneself. That is, you are these and you are no more than these, and there is no other way. That is, there is no other ways. You are these and nothing more. And I saw, for instance, in Freire, when he proceeds to elaborate a conception of liberation from this closing mentality, this closing strategy, that he always insists, for instance, on the concept that we are actually, as such, naturally, so to speak, persons, beings who transcend themselves. That is, we are not only that which the society has assigned us to be, we are something else, in spite of the fact that we cannot see it immediately. This is, for instance, a point which is connected to strategies of oppression and strategies of liberation from oppressions. And also, for instance, in all the strategies of oppression, there is the precise attempt to annihilate history, to say, so to speak, we are not a product of particular historical conditions or particular society conditions, but no, the structure of reality is something natural, that is, it is given. It is given, is natural, is not unmodifiable. Because if you say, no, all this is a product of a precise historical contingencies, precise historical influences, which of course are here, but which can be, of course, also be changed. That is, they are not natural, they are not natural laws, but they are historical happenings of events. Of course, you are immediately projected into another completely different conditions of mind, which of course opens to the possibility of changing these historical conditions, in spite of the fact that of course this can be very difficult. But one thing is to say we cannot change anything, and then another thing is, no, the world can be changed, and it has changed in the past. Well, another point which, in my opinion, is very interesting as regards the conception of the internalization of psychological internalization of the oppression is that there is the precise attempt to found something from the oppressors, to found something like the elimination of the mind of the oppressed. That is to found a sort of hegemony, cultural hegemony, mental hegemony, something more than cultural hegemony, mental hegemony, mental one-sidedness, so to speak, in order that the oppressed think in the way of the oppressors. So that is, the oppressed are completely eliminated as regards the independency of their own minds, as regards the very possibility of formulating something in our conception of mind, and they are so submitted to the way of thinking of the oppressed, of the oppressors, that they, so to speak, anticipate. They are replicants of the way of thinking of the oppressors. That is, oppression can be something more than actually physical oppression, or so to speak, so a kind of oppression in which anyway the oppressed maintain, preserve an independency of thought, of personality. Oppression can be really the very elimination of any form of mental, of mind independency of the oppressed. And more than this, it is so that the oppressed become, so to speak, a pillar of the oppressor mentality. That is, they consider that it is right uh, to to maintain and to produce again the structures of power which actually are also only an advantage for the oppressors. So these were some of the points which I have written down while hearing a wonderful contribution. And of course, I thank you very much for all the impulses you gave me through your brilliant expositions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor, for those valuable points and for being so kind to me. I think this paper still is in its beginning stages, and this is the first time I'm presenting it as well. So I really appreciate all the feedback that I could get here, and the points that you raised about Paulo Ferrero and the one about psychological internalization are both very valid points. And I think in my paper I actually kind of touch upon in a rather implicit way, not very explicitly. I do not mention psychological internalization because once you have reached to the point of psychological internalization, it means that you have gone through all other stages of physical internalization and basically oppressed to the point where I start to identify your own self with the oppressed, as Fano also mentions quite a bit in his works about the white gaze, and you start looking at yourself in through that gaze. So I think there's a lot of scope that this paper provides for questioning multiple other questions that we think about in our everyday life, such as one is this probing of the inverted gaze, or how you perceive yourself once you have been psychologically internalized to the point that you identify with your oppressor. So thank you for those points. They were really, really helpful. Thank you.
Maybe any other friends? Saha. Okay. If any of our friends want to ask any question, please indicate me in the chat box. Meanwhile, I have also some concern. My question is, when you classify two important categories. That is, one is internalization and one is normalization. Being a sociological thinking practitioner, I would just categorize two thinkers with conceptual classification. That is Gramsci and Foucault. So my question is, if you try to find answer of this question, or in other words, if you put this question to Gramsci and Foucault, how do they respond? Like, why do people persist in believing things that just aren't true? So there is a conception of, there is a very important thinker called McWhorter, McWhorter, who says very important statement, and from that statement we can find an answer of how our subjectivity forms, for that matter. He said, and I quote, "Genealogy is concerned with power relations, with mechanism deployed with a strategy of governmentality." That is managerial programs, aimed at influencing free people's conduct, and which points out reversal with shift that create a reinforcement, enabling a set of force to sequence opposition and fix themselves for a time as an institution. And this is how our subjectivity forms. Just one another connotation of just trying to find a kind of conceptual classification between normalization of violence and internalization of violence. For that matter, Dalit. If you see Dalit, you can find a way they subjugate, when a subjugate enjoys their subjugation, that much degree they have. They don't even have a kind of awareness that they are doing something very, very false consciously. So they think they are Hindu, and so they have to do this thing. So it is more about internalization rather than normalization, because when we think about normalization, we find in institution rather than finding a kind of living world. So again, the important question is, why do people persist in believing things that just aren't true? Thank you.
Thank you, Gautam. I hope I'm right. Your name's Gautam, right?
Yes, yes.
So, thank you for that intervention and the question as well. I think it's very important, and I think these were I had similar kind of anxieties when I was starting to write this paper. These were exactly the kind of questions that were crossing my mind, and rightly so. I mean, when you talk about internalization of oppression or oppression in general, two names that come to your mind are Gramsci and Foucault. I have actually quoted both of them in this paper, but not in the sense where like they're not, because this paper is also very, and it's approached from analytic philosophy point of view, and not very sociological in its approach, unfortunately, which could be which I think because I'm dabbling in quite a few fields right now, so there could be another way of writing this paper which is more sociological in nature and has that kind of an analytic approach. So I think about your question, so the example that basically you quoted of Dalits, for example, we tend to believe when we approach such a such a case study. Let's for the time being call it a case study, which is of Dalits as being oppressed to the point where they have internalized it and they believe that this is where their way of living and this is a normal way of living. But we look at it in the now. We forget that this has happened and this is a process of decades of oppression. So Dalits, for example, have been forced into believing that they are born into a certain caste because they are paying for the sins of in their past lives. So it has been justified and legitimized by those who are in positions of power, that are the, for example, in this case, the Brahmins. So this has gone on for so long, for centuries even, that people, when look at it from an observer's point of view, as somebody who is outside of it, because I personally am not a Dalit and I do not know what it is like to live as a Dalit. But when I look at Dalits in India being subjected to such horrendous kind of oppression, I feel like as if they have accepted as a norm. But maybe they have not. And they are, the structures around them, the oppressive structure around them has confined them into accepting it as a norm in order to juggernaut through it, in order to survive through it. Because what are the possibilities? They have been denied access to opportunities and resources for so long now that maybe they have internalized it, such as the case of, I have given the example of women in orthodox and dogmatic societies who become the tools of oppression, of patriarchy, and patriarchy is, and how patriarchy is operationalized through women in most conservative, dogmatic, or orthodox, religiously orthodox societies, where women who are not, for example, in the Orthodox Christians in Armenia, or Muslim women in Saudi Arabia, for example, who have been made to live a certain kind of under certain set of rules and norms for so long now that they won't allow their daughters and granddaughters to divert or deviate from that kind of upbringing. So or maybe not, maybe some of them, because we cannot even generalize it. It's the collective group that is being subject to a certain kind of oppression, but the response to it is always individual in its approach. So there may be some who are aware of their oppressive reality and the abnormality that is associated with it, because yes, it's not normal, but do not have the resources or the means to change their reality, because they have been forced and forced into such a situation and denied the resources to get out of it, immobilized to get out of it. But at the same time, there is a possibility that many of them have internalized it and accept it as their reality. But at the same time, in my paper, I write that it's not that people who have internalized it can never uh, recognize or become aware of their own reality as the oppressed, but it takes certain violent manifestations of oppression to warrant such a reaction, where they are jolted out of their accepted reality, where they are comfortable even under oppression. So when there is violence to a degree that they cannot take it anymore, uh, only then they can realize that yes, we can possibly change our reality. I think Spivak's Can the Subaltern Speak is in a very perverted way, but can find relevance here again, because she argues that no, the subaltern cannot speak for themselves, but Edward Said goes on and says, yes, they can. And rightly so, because in her own example of her aunt who commits suicide while she was menstruating, that is a sign of that it's not vocal, but it's an act of resistance to prove a point. So yeah, I think, I don't know if I have answered your question, but this is it's kind of a warp that we are all caught in, and we are still trying to figure out which is what and how to do it, maybe.
So, Minati Pradhan is a poet. She is a very creative thinker and speaker. Yes, please ask a question or comment.
No, I just want to say something. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, yes.
Yes. Yeah. Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Madam Ain Khair for a very nice presentation. But what I wanted to say is about the first part of the subject, like from being to becoming, that part from the existence to begin to be something. What I feel is it is no due to the mental pollution, only the things, oppression things starts. If you have a polluted mind, then only you will think of oppressing others. Okay, slowly in the over period of time, it becomes a societal disease, you can say. So on that topic, so just I want to say something like water, soil, air, pollution is there everywhere, and we are all talking about it. But we are not talking about the mental pollution. It is rarely acknowledged and hardly discussed. And it should be discussed in all the public forums, educational institutions, even at home. That whatever the destructive emotions that are caused by having a self-centered attitude, when it comes a self-centered attitude, then only comes next oppression. Actually, there is a difference between the self-centered and the self-awareness thing. How it will be. So to overcome this, it may sound a little bit philosophical, but it is practical also. If we practice compassion, acceptance, understanding, then we will overcome all the negative thoughts. We can embrace all the good virtues or qualities. Then for that there are few steps. Like first, you have to understand or recognize our emotions. We have to learn that what is self-destructive. In that process, it is destructive for other people also. And it is also toxic to the body, mind, and soul, every thing. No? I'm not telling that you have to suppress your negative emotions. It is very bad. Actually, it will manifest. So we have to overcome it is in a very constructive way. Channelizing it is in a better way. Like there are 3 steps for that. It means no psychology or counseling thing, I can say that. Like you have to acknowledge, okay, we have that emotion, accept, yes, I'm angry, and overcome that. Overcome and appreciate, okay, this is the way we could channelize our thing. So Ananta was telling the process of awakening, then these things was coming to my mind. So I want to ask Ananta actually the question, like the process of normalization. What is normalization? I mean, something what seems today very weird, maybe tomorrow it seems normalized. Like what our forefathers had, like they were not able to think. We are thinking this is normal. And how this internalization and normalization, these things, how it is related, like today what we call internalizing the things, tomorrow it may become normalized. So whether is not it is a changing scenario. I mean, I had a little bit confusion around this, and if you Ananta can answer. And thank you for the opportunity.
Anant Bhai is not present here. So maybe Ain, please.
Yeah, I really appreciate all that you said, Minati. I'm not sure that's the name. So I'm really I agree with everything you have said, and towards the end you asked a couple of questions about this confusion about on how normalization. I think because the question was directed at Anant Kumar, Professor Anant Kumar. So I don't know if I correct me if I'm wrong, but about not what can be perceived as normalized today can become internalized tomorrow, or what is perceived internalized today can be perceived and rightly so. Yes, of course, because I think internalization is an end product. It's what happens when normalization of a certain oppressive structure is left unchallenged for a long time. uh, Eventually the people who are at the receiving end of that normalization start to internalize it and accept it as their own reality. And as Gautam recently gave the example of Dalits, we can perhaps, not at the risk of generalizing it, but perhaps say that yes, caste is one such example where decades of normalizing their conditions into believing that this is their reality, which has been legitimized in the name of religion and something that has been signed by a certain god, therefore they must subject to it, is one way of saying that a decades long attempt at normalizing such a oppressive structure has finally culminated into an internalized reality of those people who now believe that it's fine if we pay for the sins of our past life in this life, then next life will not be born as Dalits. So that is their own way of redemption, which of course is unfortunately not right, because they maybe are already aware or will become aware, or have for the time being forgotten that it's all a part of Brahmanical caste structure. Similarly, yes, internalization can also become turn into normalization, because that is slightly complicated, because once people who have been internalized into believing, again we will take the example of caste, into believing that so this oppressive structure is their everyday reality and that they must submit to it in no matter how, when the violence against them or the injustices against them become so obscene that they cannot take it anymore, they start finding ways and avenues on how to break away from this reality. And it will not happen overnight, but but the realization of it, the point where you reach, the point where you reach to this realization that this is not a normal, or this is not an acceptable form of reality, and therefore I must break away from it, will take a long time. And from there it's another journey to completely remove yourself from there, which we can invertedly call normalization, where you do not necessarily take any drastic step which might become detrimental to your even existence, or which might cause you even further problems, but you manipulate your own your living reality in a way that you slowly start, like it's like scalping away, using a scalp rather than a hammer to change your reality. So you might subvert normalization in the sense that I on the surface I do not have the uh, I do not have the opportunity or the resources to drastically change my reality, but if I go on this process of slowly changing it, by not taking any drastic step, that might culminate into something where you break away from it eventually. I don't know if I have answered you to your satisfaction, but that's how I perceived your question.
Thank you.
I think Anant Bhai had just joined. So Minati ji can also repeat your question to him, and I think he could just.
So I was just telling that Ananta was telling the process of awakening. So I told the first part. The second thing I was asking, normalization, whether it is not a changing scenario. What we consider today is normal may not be normal tomorrow. And what we consider today may be considered normal tomorrow. So how that the relationship between that internalization and normalization happens. So that is what I was asking. And she told almost most of the thing. So thank you.
Yes, Anant Bhai, would you like to respond this question?
Yes, so it's a joy to continue the conversation. And really, with our striving to to be with our everyday life. That is striving with us. At the same time, there is a resistance to normalization. There is a critique and resistance of normalization. And that critique and resistance to normalization is very much linked to our process of self-realization and mutual realization. Therefore, while accepting certain things as a way of coping, but this coping is not our destiny, even while that is how changes have happened in history, that all all so-called fields of normalization have not really prepared the rulers for the unexpected that emerged. And it is a very difficult process. What is happening in Sri Lanka now? You just think about, now the person, I remember this story of a journalist, who was a friend, a personal friend of then President Mahinda Rajapaksa. I think his name is Basanta Kumaratunga or something like that. Very painful story. And he is calling from the moment when he is being killed by the assassins. He is calling the president, and then the president, in an interview, he reflects upon this in such a way as if it is a normal thing. He said, oh, he calls me, and unfortunately I could not help him, for example. And you see all this normalization of killing that has been happening in Sri Lanka. And now this man come Gotabaya, and now this man who was deciding the life and death of so many people, and now he just flees the country. Why does he flee the country? Because like each one of us human being, he does not want to be killed. So the point is that all this, what was happening in Sri Lanka under normalization, and it really hid a lot of processes of pathology. So therefore, it is always important to keep the critique of normalization and keep our hope alive, the spirit of resistance, which is linked to processes of self-realization, co-realization, and realization of beauty, dignity, and dialogue, which is an ongoing process. Therefore, normalization is never complete, as the struggle for beauty, dignity, and dialogue in very different difficult circumstances, it is also not complete. So then thank you, Ain, and then we continue our struggle and sadhana for beauty, dignity, and dialogue.
Minati ji, any other respected participant, if he or she has some question or concern? We are also running out of the time. So, Minati ji, please, for a group of time.
Okay, thank you. So, yeah, I Minati Pradhan, on the behalf of Swadhyaya Sahachakra and Vishwaneedam Center for Asian Blossoming, I thank all the participants for participating in such a very nice topic today. I also thank our chief speaker, Ain-Ul Khair ma'am, for her very insightful presentation and answering all the questions very patiently. I also thank our moderator, Professor Kumar Giri, for everything. And I personally thank now for answering my questions patiently now for a long time. So I thank Professor Gyanluigi for always his insightful contribution and knowledge to enlighten us. So I thank all the participants from the Zoom platform and in the Facebook platform. At the last, not the least, I thank our convener, Randhir Kumar Gautam, for arranging, executing, and doing so many things with so much of patience and dedication. I thank you all. Pardon me if I have forgotten anybody's name. I thank everybody. Thank you.